He thought the nightmare was finally over, sitting at his son Michael's table after years of silence, when a single text shattered the illusion. "Get up and go now. Don't say a word to your son." In that instant, the warmth of reconciliation turned into ice, the clinking glasses into sinister echoes, and every smile at that table looked like a mask hiding something rotten. Who sent the warning, and what danger was waiting behind those polished walls? Stay tuned, because what happened next will leave you furious and unable to look away. Subscribe and watch this story unfold. The mug was chipped at the handle, but he held it as if it were made of glass, scrubbing it for the third time that week. It wasn't just a mug. It was Caroline's mug, the one she always reached for when she brewed her morning coffee. The soap bubbles clung to his hands as if refusing to let go, and for a moment he wished they wouldn't. Because once the bubbles slid down the drain, he was left alone again, standing in a kitchen that had grown too large and too quiet. The refrigerator hummed with an indifferent tune, a soundtrack to the hollow silence pressing in from every wall. His eyes wandered to the old photographs pinned by mismatched magnets. Caroline's smile, bright and effortless, looked back at him from behind the glass. Next to her was Michael, younger then, grinning in his high school cap and gown. They had been a family once, before the shouting, before the silence, before the betrayal. The weight of absence was heavier than the ceramic mug in his hand, heavier than the years that had carved lines across his face. He dried the cup carefully and placed it in the rack in the same spot every evening, as though keeping order could keep her close. The house no longer smelled of rosemary chicken or apple pie cooling on the counter. It smelled of dust and loneliness. He would sometimes catch himself listening for Caroline's humming as she moved from room to room, only to realize that the house would never echo with that sound again. The television in the corner remained dark most nights. Crosswords went half-finished. The armchair in the living room had taken on the shape of his solitude, its leather worn smooth by evenings filled with silence instead of conversation. He glanced again at the photograph of Michael, a younger man with hope in his eyes, before money and pride had carved distance between father and son. He remembered their last conversation, the sharp words that had driven Michael out of the house and into a year of silence. It had been about money, always money. Michael had begged for a loan, swearing his big real estate opportunity would change everything. But the father had said no, and Michael had left, slamming the door on both the deal and their relationship. Caroline would have handled it better, he told himself for the 100th time. She would have softened the edges, found the words to keep them together. She always could. The phone rang suddenly, a shrill intrusion that cut through his thoughts like a blade. He fumbled with the towel, wiping his hands before reaching for the receiver. The caller ID flashed a name that made his chest tighten. Michael. For a moment he froze, breath locked in his throat, the weight of a year's silence pressing down harder than ever. When he finally answered, his voice sounded rougher than he intended, almost cautious. "Dad." Michael's voice trembled with the same uncertainty he used to have as a boy when he broke something and wasn't sure how much trouble he was in. "It's me." The father gripped the phone tighter, his heart pounding against his ribs. He wanted to be angry, to ask why now, after so long, but instead, the words slipped out before he could stop them. "Michael, I wasn't expecting—" "I know," Michael interrupted, his voice hurried, breath catching between words. "It's been too long, way too long, but I've been thinking. Emma and we realized we miss you. We miss having family." Family. The word carried more weight than any apology. It drifted through the line like a fragile lifeline, fragile enough to break with a single harsh reply. But the father didn't cut it. Instead, he let it settle in the silence. "I miss it too," he admitted quietly, surprising himself with the honesty of his own voice. Michael's tone softened, urgent yet hopeful. "Would you consider coming for dinner tonight? Emma's cooking pot roast, the one you always loved. We could sit down, talk, really talk, like we used to." He stared at the photo on the side table, Caroline smiling up at him, her hand on Michael's shoulder at his wedding. She had always said families found their way back to each other given time. Maybe she had been right. Maybe reconciliation was possible. "What time?" he heard himself ask. 7:30. "I'll text you the address. We moved to Montclair last year." Montclair, a wealthy neighborhood. Michael had always been ambitious, always reaching for more than his hands could hold, the father's chest filled with cautious pride mixed with unease. "I'll be there," he said finally. After hanging up, he sat with the photo still trembling in his hands. Caroline's smile seemed to whisper, "It's time. Go to him. Go home." For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like possibility. Upstairs, he pushed past worn sweaters in his closet until his fingers found the navy suit Caroline had insisted he buy for Michael's graduation. The suit had carried him through interviews, anniversaries, and her funeral. Now it would carry him into another milestone, the chance to reclaim his son. He unwrapped it carefully, the wool soft against his calloused hands, and laid it across the bed. The hot water from the shower loosened the muscles that had been tight with grief for so long, and when he shaved, his reflection in the mirror looked back with something he hadn't seen in years: hope. The scent of his aftershave lingered as he tied his tie. He selected a bottle of aged whiskey from the cabinet, a peace offering, something that might bridge the chasm carved by silence and pride. When his phone buzzed with Michael's text, 247 Elmwood Drive, Montclair, he hesitated only a moment before calling for a ride. Standing by the window, he waved at Mrs. Parker from next door as she watered her plants, and for the first time in months, his wave felt lighter, freer. The car ride stretched past familiar Brooklyn brownstones, past highways that gave way to manicured suburbs. Each mile carried him closer to a place where reconciliation might live, or where something else entirely waited. He pressed the whiskey bottle against his chest, gripping it like a talisman, trying to believe this night would change everything. The house came into view, a mansion that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Marble columns, manicured lawns, a fountain that sprayed water into the golden evening light. 2 luxury cars gleamed in the driveway, silent statements of wealth. He froze for a moment in the back seat, staring at the grandeur. How had Michael, who had begged for money not so long ago, climbed this high? The unease returned, prickling against the fragile hope he carried. Stepping out of the car, his shoes clicked against the stone path as motion sensor lights guided his way. Before he could knock, the massive oak door swung open. A woman stood there, middle-aged with kind eyes, wearing the black uniform of a housekeeper. Her smile was warm, but her eyes flickered with something else. Concern, maybe even warning, before the expression vanished. "Mr. Miller," she greeted, stepping aside. "They're so excited you're here." The foyer swallowed him whole. Marble floors stretched beneath crystal chandeliers, oil paintings lined the walls, and fresh flowers filled the air with perfume. Michael appeared suddenly, handsome in an expensive suit, his embrace lingering a beat too long. Sophia followed, graceful in silk, her perfume rich, her smile rehearsed. The father managed to smile back, but his unease deepened. This was no modest home. This was a palace, and palaces often hid secrets in their gilded walls. And as he followed them deeper inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that Caroline's voice, so often his guide, was whispering something different now. Not a promise of reconciliation, but a warning. He just hadn't figured out what the warning was yet. The voice on the other end of the line cracked with a tension that belonged to a boy, not a grown man. Michael sounded both nervous and hopeful, and for the first time in years, his words carried something beyond anger or entitlement. He said he missed his father. He said Sophia missed him too. And then he asked the unthinkable. Would his father come to dinner that night? For a man who had spent years dining alone, cleaning the same chipped mug just to feel close to the memory of his wife, those words landed like a jolt to the chest. He sat in silence, staring at the family photo on the side table, the one where Caroline's smile seemed to insist that families could always find their way back to one another. He wanted to believe her. He asked what time, his own voice sounding unfamiliar, almost boyish. 7:30, Michael said, as though he had been rehearsing the invitation. He promised pot roast, the dish his father had always loved, the one Caroline used to make on Sundays when the house had been alive with laughter. His son said they wanted to talk, really talk, as though they could simply pick up the pieces that had shattered years earlier. The old man's chest tightened with something that felt like hope, but also fear. He went upstairs, pulled his navy suit from its plastic cover, and laid it across the bed like a relic. Caroline had chosen it for him years ago, insisting he needed something nice for important occasions. It had seen graduations, anniversaries, even her funeral. Tonight, it would see something else, though he wasn't sure if it would be rebirth or ruin. As he dressed, he studied himself in the mirror, noting the deepened lines around his eyes and the silver at his temples. Would Michael see the years etched into his face, or only the father who had once told him bedtime stories? Would Sophia, who had never truly known him, see a man worth respecting? He selected a bottle of aged whiskey, a peace offering that carried more weight than the label revealed. He held it as though it were the key to repairing the cracks in their family. When the car arrived, he stepped out into the Brooklyn evening, waved at Mrs. Parker across the street, and for the first time in months his wave wasn't heavy with loneliness. The drive carried him past brownstones and highways, each mile peeling away the walls he had built around himself. Maybe Caroline had been right. Maybe families really could heal. But when the car slowed before the house in Montclair, the father froze. It wasn't a house. It was a monument. Stone columns rose like sentinels. Manicured lawns glowed under carefully placed lights, and a fountain sprayed water into the air, as if announcing wealth to the neighborhood. 2 luxury cars gleamed in the circular driveway. He gripped the bottle tighter, pride warring with suspicion. How had Michael, the son who once begged him for loans, found himself in such opulence? The door opened before he could knock. A housekeeper with kind eyes greeted him warmly, but there was something fleeting in her gaze, a shadow that looked almost like a warning. Then Michael appeared, polished in an expensive suit, his embrace lingering too long, too tight. Sophia followed, graceful in a silk dress, her perfume sharp and her smile perfectly rehearsed. They ushered him in with the kind of welcome that looked flawless on the surface, but carried cracks if one looked closely enough. The father forced a smile, allowed himself to be swept into a dining room that could have belonged in a magazine. The mahogany table was set with china that sparkled under the chandelier. Silver polished to a mirror shine, napkins folded into crisp shapes. It was too perfect, too practiced, as though the entire evening had been staged for effect. Still, his heart tugged at the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this was real. They sat him at the head of the table, Michael on one side, Sophia on the other, their positions deliberate, strategic. They raised glasses in a toast to family, to forgiveness, to Caroline, whose absence weighed on every word. The whiskey warmed his chest, and for a fleeting moment, he let himself believe. Maybe reconciliation was possible. Maybe his son had changed. The conversation began with stories, easy laughter, and the kind of vulnerability he hadn't heard in Michael's voice since he was a boy. But as the courses arrived, delicate appetizers, rich soup, a pot roast that tasted uncannily like Caroline's recipe, the questions shifted. They asked about his restaurants, about retirement, about legal arrangements for the future. Sophia's questions were precise, too precise, as though she had studied him. Michael refilled his glass more often than necessary, and the father felt warmth turning to fog in his head. 2 drinks should not have felt like 6. The warmth of reconciliation began to feel like a haze, a trap he couldn't yet define. He looked at his son, at the boy he had once carried on his shoulders, the young man who had begged for second chances, and now the polished adult sitting across from him with practiced charm. Hope battled with suspicion inside his chest, and the photographs of Caroline in his mind seemed to shift. Was she urging him forward toward forgiveness, or was she warning him to open his eyes? Every word, every gesture, every sip of whiskey tightened the knot in his stomach. Still, he told himself, this was family. Families fought, families broke, but maybe families could be stitched back together again. He clung to that thought like a lifeline, unwilling to let go, unwilling to believe that the son he had raised could hide anything darker than pride. And yet, as the night deepened and the dining room glittered under crystal light, he felt something shift beneath the surface. The smiles seemed sharper, the warmth rehearsed, the questions calculated. Reconciliation no longer felt like a promise. It felt like bait. He lifted his glass again, the amber liquid swirling under the chandelier, and told himself to believe. But deep down, in the silence Caroline had left behind, he knew something was coming. Something that would turn the fragile hope of this evening into something far more dangerous. The car slowed to a halt before a mansion that looked less like a home and more like a statement. Stone columns rose like watchmen, guarding a fortune, and a fountain sprayed arcs of water in the driveway's center, as though wealth itself were on display. The windows glowed with golden light, each pane reflecting back the unease in his eyes. His hand tightened on the whiskey bottle resting against his chest, the glass chilled by the night air. He wanted to feel only pride. His son had made it, had risen into a world that even he had never touched. But pride carried a shadow, and that shadow whispered the question he couldn't ignore. How had Michael, the boy who once wept for a loan, climbed so high? He stepped out of the car, shoes clicking against stone polished enough to mirror the night sky. The air smelled faintly of roses, cut fresh for someone's idea of perfection. He glanced at the 2 cars parked in the driveway. One, a black Mercedes, the other a silver BMW, both gleaming under the lights like predators waiting in silence. He remembered Michael at 22, asking for rent money, begging for second chances. That image didn't belong here. Something about this place didn't belong. Before he could knock, the oak door swung wide. A housekeeper stood there, her eyes kind, her smile warm, but her gaze lingered too long, carrying a flicker of something unsaid. She welcomed him with professional grace, ushering him into a foyer where marble floors spread like ice under his feet. A chandelier dripped crystals overhead, scattering the light into shards across the walls. Oil paintings stared down from gilded frames, each brushstroke whispering of money and privilege. The house seemed alive with a silence that was curated, not natural, the kind that made footsteps echo louder than they should. And then Michael appeared, his arms opening with the ease of a man accustomed to winning people over. His suit was sharp, his haircut precise, his smile wide enough to look real if you didn't know him. The hug lingered a second too long, the grip too tight, the words too rehearsed. "You look great, Dad," Michael said, stepping back with eyes that darted over him like a man measuring, calculating. Pride swelled uninvited in the father's chest. Michael looked successful, powerful, but unease pressed harder. That look wasn't just gratitude, it was need. Sophia entered like a queen, arriving late to her own coronation. Her silk dress shimmered under the chandelier, her jewelry subtle but no less expensive, her smile flawless as she leaned in to kiss his cheek. The perfume she wore was heavy, intoxicating, the kind chosen to distract from what lay underneath. She spoke warmly, almost too warmly, as though she had practiced every word in advance. He forced himself to smile back, but already his instincts whispered. They led him into the dining room, and the performance continued. The mahogany table stretched long enough for a banquet, but tonight it was set for 3. China glistened beneath the light, silverware aligned with military precision, napkins folded into perfect peaks. It was a scene built for admiration, but instead it felt staged, like a photograph in a magazine designed to sell something. He brushed his hand over the table's polished edge, the wood smooth beneath his fingers, and tried to swallow the unease. Michael pulled out his chair with the flair of a man trained in appearances. Sophia hovered nearby, every movement choreographed to suggest warmth and belonging. They spoke of family, of forgiveness, of starting over. Each word should have been a balm, but instead it carried the weight of expectation. His glass was filled before he had the chance to lift a finger. They toasted to Caroline, to fresh beginnings, to family. The whiskey burned in his chest, warm and familiar, but the comfort it promised was false. He told himself to be proud. His son had built something extraordinary. The house, the table, the confidence. Yet the voice in his head would not quiet. Pride without foundation was a facade, and facades eventually cracked. He studied Michael's eyes, searching for the boy he had once known, the boy who had broken toys and come running for comfort. That boy was gone, replaced by a man too polished, too eager to show off his success, too desperate to be believed. Sophia asked questions with a softness that almost disguised their sharp edges. She wanted to know about the restaurants, the profits, the future. She leaned forward, her smile unwavering, her voice lilting as though the questions were casual. But they weren't. Each inquiry was precise, deliberate, calculated. Michael refilled his glass before it was half empty, insisting with a cheerfulness that bordered on forced. The whiskey loosened his muscles, warmed his chest, but it also dulled the edge of his instincts, and he knew it. Still, he let it happen, telling himself this was reconciliation, not interrogation. The pot roast came next, filling the room with the scent of rosemary and garlic. It tasted eerily like Caroline's recipe, every bite an echo of Sundays long gone. For a fleeting moment, he let himself drift back to those days, when family was laughter and comfort, when hope was easy to hold. But as he looked across the table, the scene blurred. Sophia's smile never wavered. Michael's stories about real estate glistened with vagueness. The whiskey in his glass was never allowed to run dry. He shifted in his chair, the weight of the house pressing down on him. Pride and unease battled in his chest, neither one winning. He wanted to believe, to feel that this was the night Caroline had promised him, the night when family would find its way back together. But the perfection around him was too heavy, too deliberate. The smiles were too bright, the gestures too rehearsed. He lifted his glass again, the amber liquid catching the chandelier's light, and for a moment he wondered if it was pride or poison he was swallowing. And as the night stretched on, his unease deepened, whispering a truth he didn't want to face. Behind the marble floors and chandeliers, behind the flawless smiles and polished words, something else was waiting. Something darker, sharper, and far more dangerous than a family reunion gone wrong. Sophia's perfume struck first, heavy and deliberate. the kind chosen to announce presence before a word was spoken. Her silk dress whispered as she crossed the marble floor. Her smile cut from porcelain, her movements rehearsed down to the tilt of her head. She kissed his cheek with the grace of a diplomat greeting a foreign dignitary, not a daughter-in-law welcoming family. The warmth was there, but it burned too evenly, without the natural cracks of sincerity. He returned her gesture with a forced smile, though his gut registered the chill beneath the charm. Michael was different, and yet no less unsettling. His embrace clung a beat too long, his hands gripping as though to keep him from slipping away. His words gushed with compliments, but his eyes betrayed an anxious flicker, the look of a man who had practiced his lines in a mirror and wasn't sure if the performance would hold. The father studied him closely, trying to find the boy who once begged him for bedtime stories, the young man who once promised he would make something of himself. All he found now was polish and desperation tangled together. They led him into the dining room, a space so pristine it seemed untouched by actual living. The mahogany table stretched before him like a runway, its surface gleaming under a chandelier that fractured light into sharp shards. China plates reflected the glow like mirrors, crystal glasses threw rainbows across white linen, and silverware lay aligned with such precision it could have been measured by laser. Every detail screamed perfection, but perfection, he knew, rarely came without a price. Michael pulled out his father's chair with the ease of a maitre d', his smile wide, his gestures calculated to project both respect and control. Sophia hovered at his other side, her hand brushing the back of the chair. Her touch meant to reassure but feeling more like possession. They positioned him at the head of the table, seating themselves strategically at his left and right, flanking him as though this meal were not about family but about containment. He sat, and for a moment pride tried to push through. His son had built this life, this image of success. Yet unease twisted inside him, the gnawing sense that this wasn't about celebration at all. He glanced at the whiskey bottle he had brought, now sitting proudly in the center of the table, its label gleaming like a prize. Michael lifted it almost immediately, pouring generous portions into heavy crystal tumblers. The amber liquid swirled under the chandelier, glowing with promise and something else he couldn't name. "To family," Sophia said, raising her glass with a flawless smile that stretched too wide. "To forgiveness and fresh starts." "To Caroline," Michael added, his voice catching slightly, the name of his mother hanging heavy in the air like a ghost. The father raised his glass, the burn of whiskey tracing fire down his chest. For a fleeting moment, he let himself believe the words. Maybe this was what Caroline had promised, that time would heal, that blood could find its way home. The warmth in his chest wasn't just alcohol. It was the fragile flicker of hope. But as courses began to arrive, that flicker wavered. Sophia leaned forward with a smile that never faltered, her questions too precise, too pointed. She asked about the restaurants, about margins, about retirement, her voice carrying the cadence of interest, but the precision of an interrogation. Michael nodded along, chiming in with affirmations, steering the conversation always toward the future, toward what would become of the empire his father had built with Caroline. He answered, trying to brush off the unease, but each refill of his glass came too quickly, poured too generously. He noticed how Sophia's eyes tracked the liquid level like a hawk, how Michael's hand moved too fast to refill it before it was even half empty. He told himself it was eagerness, a son making up for lost time, but the warmth of reconciliation was beginning to feel more like fog clouding his judgment. Maria, the housekeeper, moved silently between the kitchen and the table, her eyes never quite meeting his. She placed plates before him with hands that trembled ever so slightly, her smile warm but strained. He caught her glance once, quick, darting, almost warning. But then she lowered her gaze again. It was gone before he could decide whether he had imagined it. The pot roast arrived, the scent of rosemary and garlic filling the air, carrying him back to nights when Caroline had made the same meal in their modest kitchen. His chest tightened at the memory. He took a bite, and the flavor was uncanny, as though Caroline herself had seasoned it. For a moment, he allowed himself to sink into the comfort of nostalgia. But then his eyes flicked back to Sophia, who watched him too closely, as though his reaction mattered more than the food itself. Conversation flowed with practiced ease, but beneath the surface it felt like theater. Michael's stories of real estate ventures shimmered with vagueness, offering no real details. Sophia's laughter rang a half-second too late, too precise. Every smile looked pasted on, every gesture designed for an audience. And he, sitting at the head of the table, realized he was not the guest of honor, but the centerpiece of a play staged for his benefit. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the chandelier's light. Pride still pressed at him, telling him to be glad his son had built such a life, such an image of success. But unease clawed harder. This was not reconciliation. This was strategy. The questions sharpened as the meal went on. Have you thought about retirement? Do you have a succession plan? What happens if you step away? Their voices were smooth, their smiles unwavering, but their words cut sharper than knives. He answered lightly, evasively, but his head felt heavier than it should after only 2 drinks. The room shimmered, the edges of his vision softening. Still, he smiled. Still, he played along. Because even as suspicion rose, he told himself he could not accuse without proof. Families healed with patience, Caroline had always said. Maybe he was just being paranoid. Maybe the fog in his head was exhaustion, not something darker. And yet, as Sophia leaned closer, her perfume wrapping around him like smoke, and Michael refilled his glass again with hands too eager, he knew something was off. The house was too perfect, the dinner too polished, the questions too rehearsed. The stage was set, the actors flawless. But what performance were they preparing for? That was the question gnawing at him as the chandelier's light fractured in his glass, and the room began to tilt, ever so slightly, towards something he could not yet name. The pot roast sat warm on his plate, rich with garlic and rosemary, but his focus was elsewhere. Sophia's questions slid across the table, like polished silver, smooth and deliberate, each one carrying weight that felt heavier than casual conversation. Have you thought about retirement? What happens when you're ready to step away? Who will inherit the restaurants? Michael nodded eagerly, chiming in at the right moments, his voice bright with enthusiasm that felt manufactured. The father answered with polite smiles, letting his fork scrape against porcelain as if the sound could drown out the unease growing in his chest. Each sip of whiskey burned hotter than the last, not warming him, but dulling him, blurring the edges of the evening. He had chosen that bottle carefully, a peace offering meant to bridge years of silence. But as he lifted his glass again, he realized the drink seemed stronger, sharper, almost unfamiliar. His tongue felt thick, his thoughts slower than they should have been. 2 glasses should not have left his head swimming like this. He forced a smile anyway, unwilling to show weakness, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. Sophia leaned forward, her hands folded gracefully, her eyes fixed on him with the precision of a surgeon. She asked about legal documents, about wills, about succession planning, her tone casual, but her gaze too sharp. Michael's laughter filled the gaps, but it rang hollow, bouncing against the marble walls without warmth. The father shifted in his chair, adjusting his tie, as the chandelier's glow seemed too bright, its crystals scattering light that stabbed at his eyes. He blinked, steadying himself, telling his body to hold firm even as his balance felt fragile. Maria moved silently around the table, refilling glasses, placing dishes, her eyes avoiding his, but her movements unsteady. When she set down the soup earlier, her hand trembled just enough for him to notice. Now, as she cleared plates, her eyes flicked toward him for a split second, a glance loaded with something that looked almost like fear. He wanted to hold on to it, to ask her what she knew, but Sophia's voice cut through again. Her smile too polished, her tone too sweet. Michael reached for the whiskey, pouring before his father realized his glass was empty again. The liquid sloshed higher than it should, generous, insistent. Michael grinned as though it were generosity, but the father caught the nervous flicker in his eyes. He lifted the glass, let the amber liquid swirl under the chandelier, and forced another sip past lips that already felt numb. The burn spread down his chest, hot and heavy. A fire that didn't comfort, but smothered. He tried to focus on the conversation, on Michael's stories of real estate ventures. But the details were vague, the numbers slippery, the answers evasive. Pride had once told him his son was ambitious, but tonight ambition looked like something else. Desperation dressed in expensive suits and silk dresses. His fork clinked against the plate as he set it down, his appetite gone. The food was good, too good, tasting exactly like Caroline's recipes. But even that felt staged, as though Sophia had studied his past and weaponized it for tonight. The father leaned back, his fingers tightening on the armrests, grounding himself against the fog settling into his mind. He smiled. He laughed when prompted, but every gesture now felt like performance. He studied his son's face, the sheen of sweat at his hairline, the twitch of his jaw when the questions didn't land smoothly. He saw the calculation behind Sophia's flawless exterior, the way her eyes darted between him and the papers he hadn't yet seen, but knew were waiting. Suspicion gnawed harder with every sip. Something was wrong. This wasn't reconciliation. This was strategy, a performance staged to lull him into compliance. He thought of Caroline, of the way she used to warn him to trust his instincts when the numbers didn't add up. The numbers here didn't add up either. Michael's wealth, the mansion, the cars, the endless opulence. It was all too much, too fast. And now, with whiskey dulling his senses, the pieces were sliding into place, in ways he didn't want to admit. The room felt warmer than it should, the chandelier's glow too intense, the walls closer. He loosened his tie slightly, ignoring Sophia's delicate hand brushing his arm, her touch rehearsed to appear tender. He smiled at her, but his mind screamed caution. Michael refilled his glass again, his words spilling too quickly now, pressing harder about retirement, about signatures, about how the future of the business needed to be secured. The father lifted his glass but didn't drink this time. He let the whiskey swirl, watching the amber catch the light. And in that flicker of hesitation, he saw everything more clearly. The smiles were painted on, the questions rehearsed, the dinner staged like a theater production. He wasn't a guest. He was the mark. Still, he smiled, the kind of smile that hid more than it revealed, and set the glass back down without touching it. Michael and Sophia continued their script, oblivious to the shift in his gaze. The fog in his head was heavy, but beneath it, suspicion had hardened into resolve. Something was coming, and he would be ready. And then his phone buzzed in his pocket, sharp and insistent, as though cutting through the haze with a blade. He pulled it out under the table, shielding the screen with his napkin. The message glared back at him in stark capital letters. Get up and leave. Now. Don't say a word to your son. His blood turned to ice. The phone vibrated in his palm like a living thing. The message blazing across the screen in harsh, unrelenting capitals. Stand up and leave. Now, don't say a word to your son." For an instant he thought it had to be a mistake, some wrong number meant for someone else. But the words dug into him like claws, refusing to let go. His blood went cold, the kind of cold that sinks deep and makes the skin prickle. He looked up, and the room shifted. Every detail he had dismissed earlier, the way Michael hovered with too much eagerness, the way Sophia's eyes had lingered too long on his glass, the endless refills he hadn't asked for, suddenly rearranged themselves into a pattern that made too much sense. He tried to mask the jolt that coursed through him, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sophia leaned closer, her perfume wrapping around him like smoke. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked, her voice sweet but her gaze sharp, watching him too closely. Michael's hand rested near the whiskey bottle, his eyes narrowed with exaggerated concern. "You look pale, Dad. Maybe some water." The words were coated in worry, but behind them pulsed something else, something darker. He tucked the phone into his pocket with trembling fingers, hiding the evidence of the warning. His mind spun, replaying the evening frame by frame, searching for the cracks he had ignored. Michael's insistence on opening the whiskey immediately. Sophia's subtle questions about succession planning, their unnatural eagerness about legal documents, the pot roast that tasted exactly like Caroline's recipe, as though someone had studied his past and staged it. He swallowed hard, the burn in his throat, not just whiskey, but fear. The room tilted, the chandelier above scattering light that stabbed at his vision. He told himself it was only the alcohol, but he knew better. The text had torn away the veneer. Every smile looked like a mask now, every gesture like choreography meant to distract. Even the house itself, with its polished marble and flawless decor, felt like a stage set for his destruction. "Excuse me," he muttered, his voice steadier than he felt. Michael pointed toward the hallway with quick precision. "Second door on the left. Bathroom. We'll wait for you." Sophia touched his arm lightly, her fingers cool and insistent. "Don't be long," she whispered, her smile tightening. He rose carefully, testing his balance. The floor seemed to sway beneath him, the edges of the room softening, but he kept his steps measured. He couldn't let them see how badly the fog had seeped into his head. The hallway stretched before him, lined with expensive artwork that blurred in the corner of his eyes. He passed the door Michael had indicated and kept walking, drawn forward by instinct and the echo of Caroline's voice, that steady whisper from the past that always told him to trust his gut. His hand brushed against the wall, steadying himself as he turned toward the kitchen. Maria stood at the sink, washing glasses with a deliberate calm. She didn't look up when he entered, but her shoulders tensed. She must have heard his footsteps. Still, she kept her gaze fixed on the water, on the crystal in her hands. He saw it then, the stiffness in her posture, the silent message in her refusal to meet his eyes. She knew. She had known all along. The back door was only a few steps away, the garden beyond glowing faintly under motion sensor lights. His shoes slipped on the grass as he crossed the lawn, each step heavier than the last, his heart hammering loud enough to drown out everything else. He reached the gate, pushed it open, and stepped into the quiet street. Mansions lined the road, perfect lawns concealing imperfect secrets. He pulled his phone out again with shaking fingers, reread the message, and dialed the number. The voice that answered was calm, careful, deliberately neutral. "I hoped you would call." "Who is this?" he hissed, his breath ragged. "Why did you warn me?" "You were in danger tonight, immediate danger. The whiskey you brought was altered. It multiplies the effect of alcohol. They intended for you to be confused, compliant. Legal documents were prepared. Power of attorney, business transfers. The only thing missing was your signature." The words hit like hammer blows. His knees nearly buckled. He thought of Michael's eager toast, Sophia's relentless questions, their constant hovering. The fog in his head was no accident. The plan was precise, merciless. My son wouldn't. The protest died in his throat. He remembered Michael's desperation, the debts, the pleading. He remembered the nervous flicker in his eyes. He remembered Sophia's smile that never cracked. Your son owes millions, the voice continued, calm as ice. He is desperate. Desperate people make dangerous choices. He stared down the street, watching headlights approach, his ride arriving like salvation. The car door opened, and he slid into the back seat, gripping his phone like a lifeline. Through the window, Montclair's mansions blurred past, their facades gleaming under street lamps, each one a reminder that appearances could hide rot. He closed his eyes, the voice still echoing in his ear. His son had tried to drug him. His son had been willing to sacrifice blood for survival. The realization hollowed him out, left him colder than he had ever been. But beneath the cold, something harder began to take shape. Because if Michael had been desperate enough to try once, he would try again. And the father knew the warning had saved him tonight. But it was only the beginning. As the car carried him back toward Brooklyn, away from the gilded stage that had almost been his grave, he opened his eyes and stared into the darkness. His pulse slowed, his thoughts sharpened. The text had jolted him from fog to clarity, and clarity left no illusions. Michael and Sophia weren't just greedy. They were dangerous, and the next time, he would be ready. The night air struck him like a slap, cool and sharp against his burning skin. He pulled the door shut behind him, leaving the glow of the chandelier and the suffocating charm of Michael and Sophia sealed inside that mansion. The garden stretched before him, manicured grass glistening with dew, hedges cut into perfect lines. But none of it felt beautiful. It felt like camouflage, a stage backdrop for the trap he had just escaped. His dress shoes slipped slightly on the wet lawn as he hurried toward the back gate, the whiskey fog still clinging to his head like smoke. The gate gave way with a quiet groan, and he stumbled out onto a silent street lined with mansions. Their windows glowed warm, but every lit square looked sinister now, each one hiding betrayals of its own. His phone buzzed again, and he answered with hands that shook more than he wanted to admit. The voice on the other end was calm, unnervingly calm. You made it out. Good. Who are you? His whisper was jagged, more breath than sound. Why did you warn me? You don't need my name, the voice said, neutral, deliberate. What you need is the truth. Your son owes over $2 million to men who don't wait politely for repayment. He's drowning in gambling debts, casinos, poker, sports betting, with loan sharks who break bones when deadlines are missed. The words slammed into him harder than any punch. He gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles whitened. His son, the boy he had raised, taught to ride a bike, watch cross a graduation stage, was shackled to predators who fed on weakness. That can't be, he muttered, though the conviction was gone. It's worse than you think, the voice continued, relentless. They planned tonight down to the last detail. The whiskey you brought was tampered with, a drug that multiplies the effect of alcohol. Just enough to make you compliant, confused, pliable. Legal papers were ready. Power of attorney, transfer of your businesses. Your signature was the final piece. He pressed his free hand against the cold metal of a street lamp, steadying himself as nausea rose in his throat. Every moment of the evening replayed with brutal clarity. Michael's eagerness to open the bottle, Sophia's watchful eyes as his glass never stayed empty, the questions that pressed harder with each refill. He had thought it was reconciliation. In truth, it had been an ambush. My son! The words cracked, broken under their own weight. He wouldn't. But even as he tried to speak, images betrayed him. Michael's too tight hug, the flicker of nerves in his eyes, the desperation under his charm. Sophia's rehearsed warmth, her questions too sharp, too professional. The warning text hadn't saved him from paranoia. It had saved him from annihilation. The car headlights appeared at the end of the street, his ride approaching like a beacon. He slid into the back seat, breath shallow, phone pressed to his ear as the city lights blurred outside the window. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice steadier now, steel hardening beneath the fear. "Because what they planned was wrong," the voice said simply, "and because you deserve to know the truth about your own blood. They will try again. Desperation doesn't stop with one failed attempt." "Do you know them?" His question was sharp, loaded. "I know enough. I've seen enough. You need to protect yourself. Change your locks, move your accounts, inform your lawyers. They know everything about you, every routine, every weakness. Tonight was only step one." The father sat back, the leather seat cold against his palms, and stared out at the darkened mansions blurring past. He thought of Caroline, of the life they had built together brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. He thought of every night spent in those restaurants, every dollar earned through sweat and grit. And he thought of how close he had come to signing it all away, to being robbed by the very son he once cradled in his arms. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. The voice hesitated, softer now. "You should also know this. Your son isn't alone. His wife helped. She researched everything about you. Your favorite foods, your business routines, your habits. She tailored tonight to disarm you." He closed his eyes, Caroline's voice echoing in his mind. That steady wisdom she always carried. "Trust your instincts, Jonathan. If the numbers don't add up, something's wrong." And tonight, nothing had added up. The car turned toward the highway, carrying him back toward Brooklyn, toward the modest house that suddenly felt like a fortress compared to the gilded prison he had just left. His phone buzzed again, messages from Michael lighting the screen. "Dad, where are you? We're worried sick. Come back. Let's talk." Lies, every word a trap. He deleted the messages without replying. The betrayal sat heavy in his chest, but beneath the weight, something else was forming. Clarity. The fog was gone, burned away by the truth. Michael was no longer just a wayward son. He was a threat. Sophia wasn't just ambitious. She was complicit. And the mansion wasn't a home. It was a stage for a crime. As the car crossed the bridge, the city lights glittered on the water like shards of broken glass. He stared at his reflection in the window, the lines on his face carved deeper by the night, but his eyes clear, sharp. The wound his son had carved into him would never fully heal, but it had opened something else. Resolve. The anonymous voice spoke one last time, before the line went dead. "Be careful. Desperate people make desperate choices. Protect yourself." The father lowered the phone, staring at the screen gone dark. The car rolled on, the driver humming quietly to a song on the radio, oblivious to the war that had just begun. The betrayal had pierced him deeper than flesh, deeper than bone, but it had also given him something he hadn't felt in years, a purpose sharper than grief, stronger than pride, because now he knew the truth. And knowing was the first weapon in a battle he could no longer avoid. And as the skyline of Brooklyn drew closer, the question that would haunt him pressed harder than ever. If his own son was willing to poison him for survival, how far would he go when the first plan failed? The sirens came first, low and steady, humming through the quiet Montclair night, until they grew sharp enough to rattle the windows of the mansion. He stood across the street, half hidden in the shadow of a sycamore, his body rigid as the blue lights washed across the marble columns and manicured hedges. The moment had arrived, quicker than he expected, yet not soon enough to dull the sting of betrayal. He watched the gates swing open, the squad cars flooding the driveway, boots pounding against stone as officers fanned out in formation. For a brief second, he imagined Caroline's voice beside him, whispering that justice had its own rhythm, its own timing, and that patience had finally paid its due. The front door exploded open under the force of a battering ram, shattering the illusion of perfect order inside. Shouts tore through the air, commanding, precise. Michael stumbled into view first, his tie loosened, his eyes wide with the fear he tried and failed to mask. Sophia followed, still draped in her silk dress, her hair immaculate, but her expression twisted, caught between defiance and panic. The flawless performance they had staged earlier that evening collapsed in an instant, leaving only raw desperation. He felt no triumph watching them forced against the wall, hands pinned behind their backs as steel cuffs clicked into place. Instead, he felt a hollow ache, like watching a bridge collapse in slow motion, knowing it had been crumbling for years. Michael's voice cracked through the night, pleading, bargaining, spitting excuses into the air. "Dad, this isn't what it looks like. You have to believe me. I didn't mean—" The words broke apart under the weight of the evidence officers pulled from the house. One officer carried out the whiskey bottle, tagged and bagged, its amber contents now nothing more than proof of poison. Another spread documents across the hood of a patrol car, legal papers drafted in detail, bearing his name and forged signatures. Transfer of power of attorney, sale of businesses, fraudulent filings waiting only for his weakened hand to scrawl approval. The officer's gloves flipped through page after page, each one a nail sealing the coffin of Michael and Sophia's plan. He stepped closer, unable to stay hidden any longer, his shoes crunching on gravel. The lights painted him in alternating blue and red, colors that made the lines of his face sharper, harder. Michael's eyes locked onto his, wide, wet with desperation. "Dad, listen to me. I didn't have a choice. They threatened me. I was trying to protect us." The lies came fast, tumbling over one another, hollow shells that clattered against the truth. The father's voice, when it came, was steady as steel. "No, Michael. You weren't protecting anyone. You were selling me off piece by piece." Sophia's mask cracked then, her eyes flashing with a venom that words couldn't disguise. She hissed something under her breath, sharp and bitter, before the officer shoved her toward the squad car. She stumbled, her heels scraping against the stone, her polished exterior unraveling with every step. The father's chest rose and fell, not with rage, but with a grim clarity. The betrayal had already done its worst. This was only the confirmation. He glanced at the officers as they led Michael forward, the cuffs biting into his son's wrists. Michael twisted, resisting, still trying to talk his way out, his voice shrill in the night. "Dad, please, I can fix this. Just tell them. Tell them you believe me." But he couldn't. The words lodged in his throat, because belief was something Michael had squandered long ago. What he saw before him wasn't the boy he had raised, the boy Caroline had loved so fiercely. What stood in chains was a man who had traded blood for greed, family for survival, love for desperation. The officers shoved Michael into the back of a squad car, the door slamming shut with a metallic finality that echoed across the driveway. Sophia was already inside another car, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes hard, unrepentant. The engines roared to life, and the cars rolled away, carrying the ruins of a family into the night. He stood alone then, the mansion looming behind him, silent, stripped of its false grandeur. Maria, the housekeeper, lingered at the edge of the lawn, her hands clasped tightly, her face pale. Their eyes met, and in her gaze he saw both apology and relief. She had been part of the warning, the hidden ally who had risked everything. He gave her a single nod, the only thanks necessary between two people who had seen the same truth. The neighborhood grew quiet again, the hum of the police fading into the distance. He turned toward the street, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his mind clear. Justice had come swiftly, but it carried no joy, no comfort. It was only the closing of a chapter written in betrayal. The son he had once dreamed would carry his legacy forward now carried chains instead. The daughter-in-law, who had smiled with perfect charm, was now revealed as the accomplice she had always been. As he walked away from the mansion, his shadow stretching long under the street lamps, he felt Caroline's absence more acutely than ever. She would have wept for Michael, begged him to forgive, to try again. But forgiveness was a bridge burned to ash tonight. What remained was truth, harsh and unrelenting. He reached the corner where his car waited, the city lights glowing faintly in the distance. His hands rested on the roof for a moment, grounding himself, steadying the storm that still churned inside. Betrayal had gutted him, but it hadn't destroyed him, and justice, though bitter, had given him clarity. As he slid into the driver's seat, the leather cold against his back, he exhaled slowly. His family's bloodline had fractured beyond repair, but his own will remained intact. And somewhere in the hollow left behind by betrayal, a seed of resolve had taken root. Because justice was not the end. It was only the beginning. And as the mansion shrank in his rearview mirror, swallowed by darkness, he knew that the true reckoning, the one that would test him beyond police reports and courtrooms, was still to come. The street had gone quiet after the last of the squad cars disappeared, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves and the faint hum of distant traffic. He stood at the edge of the mansion's driveway, the blue and red glow gone, replaced by the raw silence that follows disaster. His chest ached with the weight of what had just unfolded, but the ache wasn't for himself. It was for the son he had lost long before the cuffs clicked shut. Michael hadn't just gambled away money. He had gambled away blood, and tonight he had lost everything. A shadow moved near the hedge. Mariah stepped forward, her hands clasped together, her eyes wide but steady. She looked smaller in the night, stripped of the uniform's formality, just a woman who had chosen courage when silence would have been safer. He met her gaze, and for the first time since Caroline's death, he felt something almost like gratitude swell inside him. Without her warning, he might have been lying inside that mansion now, drugged, stripped of everything he had built, his legacy signed away in shaking handwriting. "Mr. Miller," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of what she knew. He shook his head gently. "You saved my life, Maria." Her eyes glossed with tears she fought to contain. "I couldn't let them do it. Not to you. I saw the papers. I heard them talking when they thought I was out of earshot. I knew tonight wasn't about family. It was about stealing everything you are." The words cut, but he nodded. Truth had always been sharper than denial. He stepped closer, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, the simple gesture carrying more weight than any thank you could. For months he had felt utterly alone, abandoned by the one person who should have carried his name forward. Tonight he discovered that loyalty could come from places he least expected. As they stood together on the quiet street, the mansion looming behind them like a hollow monument, he thought of Caroline. She had always said family was more than blood. It was loyalty, sacrifice, love when it mattered most. Maria had proven her right. The bitter truth was that his own son had chosen greed. But in its place, a woman with no obligation had chosen courage. The bitterness lingered, of course. He could still hear Michael's voice, desperate, pleading, spewing excuses as the officers led him away. That sound would haunt him long after the courtroom, long after the verdicts. But standing there with Maria, he realized that his grief didn't have to hollow him out. it could harden into something else. Resolve. They walked together toward the corner where his car waited. The night air carried the faint scent of cut grass and roses, a cruel reminder of how carefully Michael and Sophia had staged the evening. Maria spoke quietly, her words halting, as though afraid to intrude on his storm. She told him how she had found the documents hidden in the study, how she had overheard the plan, how she had debated whether to risk her job, her safety, even her future by interfering. In the end, she said, she had thought of Caroline's photograph in the hallway, the one that still hung above the console table. "I saw the way you looked at her picture every time you came in," Maria confessed, "and I thought, if Caroline were here, she would want someone to protect you. So I did." His throat tightened. He hadn't wept since the funeral, but her words nearly broke the dam. Instead, he inhaled deeply, steadying himself against the pull of grief. He nodded once sharply, like a man making a vow. "She would have been proud of you, Maria. More than proud." They reached the car, the driver waiting silently. He opened the door, then paused, turning back to her. "If you need anything, ever, you come to me. You're not just an employee anymore. You're family." Her eyes widened, then softened, gratitude breaking through the fear. She nodded, clutching her hands to her chest as he slid into the back seat. The car rolled forward, the mansion shrinking behind them until it was just another silhouette against the night. The drive back to Brooklyn was quiet, the city lights stretching across the water like broken glass. He stared at his reflection in the window, his face drawn, his eyes hollowed by betrayal, but sharpened by clarity. Justice had been served, but it had come at the price of a son. That cost would never leave him. But neither would the truth he had learned tonight. Family isn't always who shares your blood. Sometimes it's who risks everything to save you. Maria's courage had given him something unexpected: faith. Faith that loyalty could still exist in a world poisoned by greed. Faith that Caroline's words about family were more than sentiment. Faith that even in the ashes of betrayal, there could be embers worth protecting. As the car crossed the bridge, he let his eyes linger on the skyline, the lights glittering against the dark. His heart was heavy, but not hollow. The betrayal had carved deep wounds, but Maria's loyalty had stitched something back together, rough but real. He leaned back, the leather seat cold against his shoulders, and exhaled slowly. Tomorrow would bring questions, headlines, lawyers, the slow grind of justice. Tomorrow he would face the wreckage of his family name. But tonight, in the aftermath of ruin, he carried a truth sharper than pain and stronger than grief. Blood had betrayed him. Loyalty had saved him. And as the city came closer, glowing like a promise against the horizon, he knew this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a different story, one where he no longer stood alone, and one where the word family would never mean the same again. Life has a way of teaching us that family is not always defined by blood, but by loyalty, respect, and courage when it matters most. In this story, a father learns the most painful truth. His own son, blinded by greed and desperation, was willing to sacrifice him for wealth. Yet in the same night, he also discovers that true family can come from the most unexpected places. Maria, a housekeeper with no obligation beyond her job, risked everything to protect him. Her bravery reminds us that loyalty often shines brightest where we least expect it. For older adults, this lesson strikes close to home. We cannot control the choices of our children, but we can choose to surround ourselves with people who honor us, respect us, and stand by us when life turns dark. As we grow older, what truly matters is not material possessions, but the relationships that carry love and integrity. Trust is precious, and once broken, it may never return. But loyalty, once proven, can be stronger than any blood tie. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more powerful lessons that remind us of what really matters in life.